All right, well, it is noon here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so that means it is time to say good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this edition of PON Live from the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. I'm Nicole Bryant, the Managing Director here at PON, and I am delighted to welcome our participants from all over the world for our first PON Live event of the new year of 2023. So this is the occasion to say, on behalf of the community at the Program on Negotiation, a very happy new year to you wherever you are in the world. Actually, last night we had our PON New Year's party here in Cambridge, and it was a great occasion to unite our PON Executive Committee members, our staff, and our fellows for a celebration. And so we are sending our best wishes to all of our participants and community members. And as many of you know, the Program on Negotiation has led the world for 40 years in research, curriculum development, and executive education trainings related to the fields of negotiation, mediation, and conflict resolution. And amongst the ways that PON supports our field is through our sponsorship of next generation scholars and practitioners. And to that end, we are pleased to offer a series of fellowships and prizes every year to outstanding graduate students from across the world. And the most prized of these fellowships is our Graduate Research Fellowship, which awards a year-long stipend to complete work in the field. And over the years, we have sponsored hundreds of students in this matter, and many have gone on to successful careers in academia, diplomacy, and the corporate world. And indeed, if you are a regular PON Live viewer, you have seen many of our former fellows who have gone on to outstanding careers come back and present their work in various fields. So today, we are pleased to present the work of two of this year's fellows, Helen Winter and Nicolás Parra Herrera, as they near the conclusion of their respective fellowships. Today's format is that each of them are going to present for about 20 minutes, and then there will be time for questions and answers. First up today is Helen Winter. I am delighted to introduce her to you. Helen is a PhD candidate at the European University Viadrina, and she is also a mediator and a founder of a charitable organization based in Berlin that works with refugees and locals to manage and prevent conflict. Helen has been a wonderful and vibrant part of our community. She is joining us from Germany today, and we are delighted to present her work as she nears the conclusion of her fellowship and her PhD. Helen, the Zoom floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I so appreciate this opportunity to share with all of you my research, and I thank the entire PON team, Nicole, Diane, James, Billy, and Guhan for this amazing opportunity. So today I'm going to talk about peer mediation among refugee communities, a path to self-efficacy and sustainable conflict prevention. This research project is actually linked to the charitable organization that I co-founded back in 2018, right after the refugee crisis happened in Germany. And this organization seeks to empower refugees and also locals with conflict resolution skills, such that our participants become peer mediators in their communities. Today, I'm going to give you, first of all, a little bit of an outline of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the status quo in refugee shelters in Germany and also the situation and the conflicts that arise there. Then I will introduce peer mediation as a concept to counteract some of the conflicts there. And I will talk about this empirical research project of mine, introduce the method of the empirical research study, and also go about my findings that I here called a path to self-efficacy, and then go into some of the examples. I would like to start today's presentation with a quote that sets the tone of the presentation. And it's a quote by Hannah Arendt, who was a refugee of the Nazi regime. And she wrote extensively about her experience as a refugee in a book called The Jewish Writings. She said, "We lost our home, which means the familiarity of daily life, We lost our occupation, which means the confidence that we are of some use in this world. We lost our language, which means the naturalness of reactions, the simplicity of gestures, the unaffected expression of feelings. In this quote, Hannah Arendt talks about identity loss. And according to Professor Elmar Folani, a sociologist in Germany and also a refugee, identity is really paramount to people. We want to feel like we are the same person yesterday, like 20 years ago, that we are the same person today. And of course, when you flee from atrocities, from war, from violence, you not only experience all these harmful things, but also you lose part of your identity by leaving your home behind and by leaving all the things that are familiar to you behind. Going to the next slide. Okay, so here you see the status quo in refugee shelters. So in 2016, 1.2 million people fled their home country and came to Germany. And if you can recall, former Chancellor Merkel famously said, "We can do it." And of course, that a lot of administrative challenges happened at the same time because that many people had to find shelter in Germany. And I'm quite proud to say that we took the bulk. However, of course, we had to deal with these challenges. And what happens is that when people come to Germany, they are first placed into arrival centers and then they are distributed into long-term accommodation. So some of the people that arrived back in 2016 are still living in refugee shelters. These refugee shelters are placed in the far outskirts of cities or also in the countryside. And that means that they are quite isolated and little interaction happens between German locals and refugees. And as you can imagine, just now following the Ukraine war, another 1 million people came to Germany, mostly women and children that also had to find shelter. And now in these shelters, the infrastructure is quite poor. Many people, sometimes up to 800, live in a cramped space. And all of the factors that you can see here on the slide contribute to conflict that arises on a daily basis, such that the police has to intervene quite frequently. Cultural misunderstandings, ethnic differences, language barriers, monotony and boredom because people do not have a perspective to work. They do not have a permit to work and they're waiting for their asylum. All these factors lead to conflict. Another big part of that is, of course, psychological trauma. 50% of all refugees are highly traumatized, according to a study done by Abbott et al. And so we try to, with Resolute, we try to mitigate some of these conflicts through our concept called psychosocial peer mediation. We wrote about our best practices in a paper in Conflict Resolution Quarterly just 2 years ago now, 2021. We wrote about how we do this method. And so what is quite important is the empowerment aspect of the method. So such that peers, so the residents in the shelter, but also locals, the neighbors, can join the training, the peer mediation training, and can take matters into their own hands rather than having an outside mediator come in or social workers come in and solve conflicts, which is what has been done before. The peers themselves are empowered. They are being trained in peer mediation. They get the tools to do it themselves. We usually start our training with a story sharing because it is very important to establish trust in the first place. That means that our participants come together and they are allowed to ask each other difficult questions on difficult topics, such things that you would never talk about when you do a simple cooking event together. So for example, they ask each other, why do Germans sit away from me on the bus? Or why do Arabs speak so loudly on the phone? Or, why do Germans never have time after work and things like that. And so they really dig into these difficult conversations and we try to also do a little bit of a needs assessment at that stage to understand what the conflicts are in the respective community. At the same time, of course, this serves to counteract biases and to raise awareness on prejudice. Then after the story sharing, we go into a set of role plays. We train in conflict resolution, for example. What role does emotion play in conflict? What role do cultural misunderstandings play in conflict? And then we train in peer mediation. That's also highly interactive and role play based. And all the role plays that we do are related to real life conflicts that happen in the refugee context, in the shelter and in the neighborhood. We do have unique trainer characteristics. So I myself have led many trainings alongside a co-trainer who is a refugee herself or himself, because you know, when I give such trainings, I always say, I cannot imagine what it's like to flee your home country. I have not had that experience. Though my grandfather's family had to flee their home, I can only empathize with you on what that's like, but I can never imagine what it's really like. And I can only give you the tools of mediation. But my colleague, Mohammed here, he has lived in a shelter like this before. He's trained in mediation. He's now here to help you, and he's now studying politics, and he's moved out of the shelter. So that really functions as a sort of a role model for the participants to see that they can get out of there, which is ultimately the goal, right? And so it fosters trust and it fosters transparency, and it makes the people believe in what we do. And that is very, very, very critical. Without our co-trainers, we would have never been able to do it, because it also shows that they are super interested in delivering these trainings and that it's important to them, and they learn so much from the participants as well. And then this training leads into the establishment of peer mediation clinics. In these clinics, we mostly do bicultural co-mediations. That means that the mediators mirror the parties, and that also has proven to lead to higher party satisfaction and higher trust in the mediation process if they find the mediators represent their respective cultures. And again, mental health awareness is sort of a red thread woven into our curriculum, because we understood that trauma is a main reason for conflict to arise in the first place. And so it is very, very important to us to raise awareness and then work with partner organizations that can treat the trauma. So we are just, you know, providing a low threshold awareness on mental health issues with psychologists that work with us. Now, about my research project, it's an empirical research project and applied the grounded theory methodology, which was first established by Anselm Strauss and Barney Glaser in the late 70s, and meanwhile has become a widely known research methodology in the field of sociology. I'm not going to go into too many details, but I just want to give you a brief overview on how this method works. So basically, a theory is not proven, but it's an inductive research method. That means that a theory emerges based on the data that's collected by the researcher. So basically, I collected data in 2 refugee shelters in Berlin with 2 groups of each 20 participants, 20 peer mediators. And I collected data through my own observations, through group discussions and interviews, and extensive interviews one-on-one. And once the data is collected, you basically look at the data and you give the data code steadily. You can do one-by-line coding, but you basically group the data and you form codes, and then you compare the codes with one another and you form categories by constant comparison. And then you see if patterns emerge, and then you go back into the field. You try to verify some of the categories that you found with the data. So it's a circular methodology. And then so slowly but surely, eventually, a core category emerges. And that is basically what I tried to answer, was the question, what essentially constitutes peer mediation from the participant's point of view? So a very open empirical question. And that is very helpful, because this method, the grounded theory, you apply it to real life context. And so I studied a real life context, and I wanted to understand what it is that constitutes peer mediation from the participant's point of view. And what it interestingly was my main finding was self-efficacy. Now, what is self-efficacy? Self-efficacy is people's beliefs about their capabilities to produce designated levels of performance that exercise influence over the events that affect their lives. And this term was first coined by Bandura in 1994. And here on the slide, you see a figure that explains the concept of self-efficacy a little bit easier. So basically, when I used to go to school, I was not really good at math. And so sometimes, I received a C or so in a math test. And so then I studied a lot, and then one day I received a B. And so that constituted a self-efficacy experience. I understood, oh, if I study a lot, I can actually receive a better grade. And so that led to a self-efficacy belief. I'm able to receive a better grade if I do X, Y, Z. And that can lead to a self-efficacy expectation that, if I do these certain things, I can actually reach these goals, that I am capable to produce these levels of performance. And again, the circle goes around and around and comes to another self-efficacy experience. And so I wanted to talk about this a little bit more, because it can be actually a matter of survival, that we have the self-efficacy belief in us as human beings. There was a study done by Helen Winter, who wrote a book on mindfulness, and she conducted a study in a nursing home in Connecticut, in which elderly residents were each given a choice to care for houseplants, and they were also given the choice to design their day-to-day. So what they're going to do, the activities they wanted to choose. And a year and a half later, not only were these people more cheerful and active and alert than a similar group in the same institution who were not given these choices and responsibilities, but many more of them were still alive. In fact, less than half of the decision-making residents had died, as had those in the other group. So this is a really crucial point, that if you give human beings the decision-making power, if they can decide what they want to do in their lives, they regain their self-efficacy, and that also constitutes their well-being and also constitutes their health. And so, as you know, when refugees are, living in refugee shelters, they do not have many choices. They might not be able to do the same task that they used to do in their life, like, just simply going to the doctor or filling out a form. They might need constant help from social workers, and that takes a lot of that away. And that is just, the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. So, just giving opportunities to foster that self-efficacy is crucial. And peer mediation, we found that it can be such a thing. Here, I want to give some examples of how that showed itself in the data. So basically, the woman you see here on the left shaking hands with the women on the right, she wanted to bring her own role play to the training. And that was actually quite frequent, that participants said, we don't want to do the pre-made role play that you brought. We want to do our own role play. And so in this case, she brought a a conflict that she had with her brother, who was still living in Afghanistan at that time. And, her daughter had passed away, and she was there with her husband in Germany now. And her brother constantly bothered her to send money home. And she said, okay, he thinks that money grows on trees in Germany, but that's not the case, because actually I'm living on social welfare. I'm stuck here in the shelter. My husband can't work. And I just want to do mediation with him. But in this case, she said, I want to play the role of my brother. So here you see a picture with her kind of coming to an agreement with herself, so to speak, fictively, where she understood and where she did some expectation management on what conversation might have to happen with her brother. And she later said, there's some days in your life where you learn as much as in your whole life. And today is such a day. And she also said, I can imagine very well to come across any conflict with what I have learned and to be the mediator. So this is a very strong self-efficacy expectation, right? That she can do it, that she can come across any conflict with what she has learned and she can solve this conflict. Then I want to go talk about Hussein. Hussein was a lawyer in his home country. Now in Germany, he was not able to work as a lawyer anymore, and he brought his entire family to the training, his 2 daughters and also his wife. And he was very, very passionate about peer mediation. And that's what he said. He said, I was a lawyer in my home country, but now I unfortunately work as a construction worker in a big construction company in drywall. Back in Syria, I was working as a lawyer, and that was pretty much like being a peer mediator. Because as a lawyer, you also have to try to solve a problem with the disputing parties. And for me, that was quite like working as a peer mediator here. But in Syria, I actually did it between companies, and here in Germany, between residents. And I have successfully been working as a peer mediator for about 1.5 years now. So you can see that Hussein finds meaning in being a peer mediator because he not only used to be a lawyer, but also working as a mediator was part of his identity that was then lost through fleeing his home country. And so by doing this again, he can regain parts of that identity, he can regain parts of that self-efficacy and find a meaningful task. He later reported, you feel good, and then you are also respected more by the people because of your role and because you do it well. We can support the social workers in the shelter because we can also speak Arabic and maybe even understand the cultures and mentalities better than them. Communication between us and the residents was also easier because the social workers also needed a translator in case of conflicts. So I was very helpful for the social workers in the shelter and the shelter's management. So here he touches upon the power dynamics actually, right, that are there between the residents and the social workers and the shelter's management that used to be there when conflict arises and that used to have the responsibility to deal with it. And he says, I was very helpful for them, not only for the residents, but also for them. And so that brings me to a second point that I also found in my research, which was, of course, a shift in power dynamics. So one of the peer mediators pointed out that in the beginning, before the training, the shelter's management was always the one solving the problems. But then the situation changed because then we were in charge and not the shelter's management when any conflict happened in the shelter. Another peer mediator said that even the mentality of the residents changed as a result. So that means that before maybe they were hesitant to use peer mediation, but then they trusted in their own peers, which is also an empowering experience when you understand you can go to your own peers. And so indirectly, it's an indirect benefit for the residents as well. The shelter's management saw it in a similar way. They said, you know, in any case, this is very helpful. And of course, the residents have the opportunity and they realize that they cannot just come to us, that there are also other peers. And this peer mediator is actually my favorite because he was just so passionate. He said, you know, there were problems that could not be solved for a long time, but we, the peer mediators, we were able to do it in less than 5 minutes. And then the management wondered how we did it so easily. I mean, I'm sure it didn't take 5 minutes, but at least, you know, he's very convinced and believes in his capabilities of mediating these cases. And then he brings an interesting aspect, which is at home, there was something like a mediator, but in a different way. Not that you are trained, but that, for example, an older person talks to both parties in the dispute. So he's talking about a rich experience that most of these participants already bring to the table when in some of their cultures, there's, for example, elder dispute resolution, and they have knowledge on that and they can bring it to the mediation process and to the mediation training, which is why another key finding is that, you know, creative agreements and, you know, encouraging for the mediation process to be flexible are very, very, wanted in our trainings. Because, for example, here you see 3 women from Angola, and they were having a dispute. And then when they came to an agreement, they said, why do we want to place all the responsibility on the mediator that we actually stick to this agreement? We don't want to write it up. We think it's too much responsibility for her. And then the mediator asked them, so what do you want to do instead? And then they said, well, maybe we can, maybe we can swear by the Bible and place the responsibility on God that we will actually stick to this agreement. And so that's what they did. Here, this is Ibrahim, and so again, like the process is allowing for the parties to influence the process and to shape it, right? And so Ibrahim also applied cultural tradition to reach an agreement. Here, he was actually an artist, and he did many designs for weddings and things like that, and artwork in Syria. And here you can see a piece of art that he made to advocate for the peer mediation clinic at the summer festival. He was the one mediating many, many cases among families that had disagreements about how their children are raised. And in one case, the families argued for hours and hours. And at the end, he said, okay, we've been talking for 5 hours and we still haven't reached an agreement. And he decided to refuse to drink the tea that he was offered by the disputing parties. And now not drinking the tea is a big, big affront in Syria, because you're the guest, right? You're the mediator, you're the respected person. And if you don't drink the tea and if you don't accept that, the parties lose their face, the families lose their face. And so the parties really quickly made up and came to an agreement. So, and that was one way to do it as well. Coming back to the original quote that I mentioned, we lost our home, which means the familiarity of our daily life. We lost our occupation, which means the confidence that we are of some use in this world. We can at least say that these participants have regained part of their confidence that they are of some use in this world, and have regained part of their self-efficacy. So just summarizing some of the key findings, peer mediation leads to strengthened self-efficacy beliefs. It helped, in my research, it showed that it helps to support individuals to prepare for the labor market, because those who did the peer mediation training were the ones that moved out of the shelter, were the ones that found a job, were the ones that found an apartment, and were the ones that actually came back to volunteer in the shelter as a mediator, because it gave them a purpose. So the peers help other peers resolve conflict sustainably, which leads to reduction of conflict in the shelter and its surrounding, but also the peers help themselves to integrate into German society. And that is, of course, also good for society. And so in one case in Berlin, we have actually managed to change a policy which now encourages peer mediation in refugee shelters, and which encourages the carriers of refugee shelters to implement these mechanisms. And so this is something that I find very valuable, because the policymaker sees and understands that this can be a systemic method for conflict resolution in the refugee context, in refugee shelters. We know that migration is going to be one of the world's biggest challenges, actually, especially now with the climate change and everything. So we understand that this can be a systemic method, not only to mitigate conflict, but also to bring people back to their self-efficacy and to integrate them into the labor market. And this benefits individuals as much as it also benefits the society. So of course, I would love to do further studies. Maybe I would ask, in 5 years, the peer mediators where they are now and how they're doing. And so more is to be done. And I hope I was able to give you a little bit of an overview of this really big project. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen. And we do have some questions for you in the Q&A. I'm going to select some of them. We'll see. We might not be able to get to all of them, but if you have a question for Helen, please also go and feel free to add it. I will say off the bat that I really appreciate your engaging presentation, and everyone, this is the same energy we've been seeing from Helen throughout her fellowship, and you can see why she was such a compelling candidate for PON with this incredible work. So the first question we have that I'll submit to you is, can you say a little bit more about what kind of mediation was used? Facilitative, transformative narrative, or other?
That's a very, very good question. So we used, so as I tried to address a little bit in the presentation, we used a very facilitative way of mediating. However, we encourage the people to bring in their knowledge and what they know about mediation and to use that. So we allow for this flexible concept of mediation that can shape the mediation process in a way such that, you know, it actually leads to an agreement and it leads to results. Some people might say we cannot call it mediation anymore, but that's of course debatable.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a second question, which is around your use of grounded theory. And there was a question about, did you consider or use story collection and self-signification using the application Spring or SenseMaker? That's a very technical question. I don't know if you're familiar with these and if this was a tool in your toolbox.
This was not a tool in my toolbox. So you see, I'm a lawyer, and for me, it was quite challenging to learn about sociology and about these research methodologies. And of course, I had a supervisor from that field. I have a lawyer supervisor and a sociologist supervisor, and they were very, very, very helpful with that. And it was quite interesting to see, because as lawyers, we always have a theory in mind and then we want to prove it, you know, but here I had to basically, you know, start from scratch and understand and relearn how science is being done. And so what I did was extensive interviews, I did observations, and I did group interviews, and then I analyzed this data. But I hope that I'm going to be done soon, and then you will read more about this, hopefully in my PhD. But I understand that usually just the supervisor and hopefully my mom will read this piece. But I love the enthusiasm. Thank you.
Wonderful. And Helen, are there, we have a question about, is there a plan or intention to scale up the program?
That's a great question. So now we've been active for the past 5 years in Germany, and we've been in several Bundesländer, so sub-states in Germany. And we have had some interest also from the Netherlands to replicate the program. We've worked internationally, but only digitally. So we've done story sharings with Afghan refugees all around the world that had to resettle, and then they shared their stories with one another as means to motivate each other and to understand what it's like to share this experience and how to tackle some of the challenges, you know, even though they relocated into different countries. So we've worked internationally. And of course, we would love to expand internationally, and ideas of collaboration are always welcome. Please shoot me an email. I'd be happy to get in touch. Yes.
Wonderful. Could you speak to the types? Is there a specific type of conflict that was being mediated more than another? Were there things between populations? Was it you know, between refugees? Were things regarding the local German population, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think one conflict that's quite often mediated is really about family disputes. It's family disputes on how people raise their children, and, you know, of course, noise and understanding different schedules, such as like conflicts you would have among roommates when you live together. But the difference is that these conflicts can escalate much, much more easily than other conflicts, because of course you have all these cultural nuances that contribute to misunderstandings. And so there were many conflicts also about, of course, neighbors that were complaining, that were scared to even enter the refugee facility, the shelter context, because they didn't know what it's like. And then actually when they came and sat down with us and came to the training, they understood, okay, it's not scary, they can be here, you know, and it was easier for them to relate to that context. And sometimes they brought other people, but of course we cannot reach everybody as much as I would like to reach those that have the most prejudice or are even racist. It's not easy to get them on a table, but just, you know, by doing the work, it creates an awareness and it brings people together that can talk about some of these difficult and challenging topics of our time.
Yeah, wonderful. Helen, just to conclude, I think a little bit more questions around kind of the populations that you were serving with Resolute. So multiple refugee groups from different origins, and that's the case?
Yes. Thank you for this question. Sometimes it was quite hard. We had sometimes 5 different language groups in a training. So we had Afghans, we had Dari, Faris, of course, and then we had people from Syria, Arabic. Then we had now people from Ukraine, Russian, Ukrainian, and it was quite hard. And then we had to sometimes improvise and bring in translators on the spot. And sometimes we said, you know, that's too many language groups because people want to focus and they want to learn something. So you have, like, if you work with 2 language groups, that's the ideal scenario. But we were serving very, very different populations all together at the same time. And you always find helpful for participants that speak German a little bit better than others. And so they are the ones that then also can step in and help others. However, we always make sure that one of our co-trainers serves also as a translator and also a cultural translator. So we want to provide for that. And it's always a little bit tricky to plan. You know, I've done also corporate trainings. It's nothing like it. You're lucky if you have a list of participants and then you know who's attending, but sometimes it can change at the very last minute. So you have to be very flexible to do this and patient. Sometimes our trainings basically, you know, they were set to start at 4 p.m., but then they started at 5 p.m. And so we have to know that in advance and we plan that in, you know, because that's just the way it is. And Germans are very punctual people, so it wasn't always easy.
Yes, some of those more important cultural differences coming across. I know we do have a lot of questions. We're unfortunately not going to be able to get to all of them. We do have a question, Helen, about where people can learn more about this work and support Resolute.
Yes, so you can go to our website, resolute.com. Resolute is spelled with a 3 instead of an E because it stands for R3, respect, relate, resolve.
Wonderful. We will put that in the chat and link to it. And if you have any further questions for Helen, you can find her contact information also there, I imagine. And if not, we'll make sure that people can follow up. Because this is an unusual presentation, because of course today we have another speaker coming on. So Helen, thank you so much. Congratulations on all of your work. Delighted to have you with us. So I will now invite our next guest to the virtual Zoom floor, our guest slash presenter, Nicolás, and thank him very much for being here today. So Nicolás Parra Herrera is an SJD candidate here at Harvard Law School, in addition to being a graduate research fellow with the program on negotiation. He is a graduate of the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, where he received magna cum laude degrees in law and philosophy. He has published a number of books and has a forthcoming book with one of PON's co-founders, Larry Susskind, that we are looking forward to. And before his graduate studies, he was a clerk at the Colombian Constitutional Court and also worked at a variety of law firms. So we are delighted to have Nicolás with us to present his work over the course of the past year. And I will now hand over the virtual Zoom microphone.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you all for being here. Let me just start sharing my screen. I want to start by thanking PON, Nicole, Guan, James, Diane, and the PON family for making this research possible. And special thanks to Larry Susskind, Janet Hawley, Martha Mino, and Amy Cohen, who in different ways also have motivated me and challenged the way I think about alternative dispute resolution, or ADR. I'm currently writing a dissertation about the intellectual history of ADR in the 20th century. What I will be presenting today is an overview of my research agenda and how am I rethinking the intellectual roots of ADR. When I read Getting to Yes for the first time, I thought, wow, this is very insightful, but I want to understand the trajectories of some ideas that made it possible and the ideas that ultimately made possible the field of negotiation and ADR, broadly speaking. So my research tries to trace some of those ideas. And one brief clarification before starting is that since this is a work in progress, I'm currently doing interviews with some of the founders of PON and digging in some archival work. I will spend more time here exploring the first part of the research, what I call proto ADR, which is an initial phase of practices and ideas on dispute resolution in the progressive era, where the field vocabulary was more about solving structural social problems rather than maximizing individual interest and streamlining institutions. So with that in mind, let me begin with a distinction on how ADR is usually understood, which is the programmatic approach. ADR is a set of methods, as you know, and processes to manage and resolve or prevent disputes or conflicts without adjudication, grounded on ideas of self-determination of the parties. And some of the paradigmatic examples, as you well know, are negotiation, mediation, arbitration, or hybrid models. So why I call it programmatic? Well, mainly because this project aims either to create new methods and processes to respond to new types of conflicts, or it aims to improve the existing methods by making them more efficient, satisfactory, or less expensive and appropriate. This project is very important, but I think it's part of the story of ADR and negotiation and has some shortcomings. For instance, it occludes in some way the history, but also the politics or economic implications and philosophical influences that are informing the field. So I propose a different lens to study ADR more as an intellectual movement. I'm not inventing the wheel here. This approach to ADR is informed by other scholars like Mickey Alberstein or Amy Cohen, who in separate ways have highlighted the complexities of the ADR discourse. And perhaps a metaphor might illustrate the frame or lens I'm proposing. Think of ADR as an iceberg. What we see is the programmatic understanding right on top, how to pair conflicts with dispute resolution methods, how to make dispute resolution methods more efficient. But this, as important as it is, it covers what lies below, right? This is important, but my research tries to explore what lies below this surface and how the field came to be. So my project therefore narrates an intellectual and an oral history too of some strands of alternative dispute resolution in the 20th century. And to do this work, I propose the following assumptions. One is ideas, for me at least, come from people with projects. I believe that ADR, negotiation, and institutions, like other ideas, come from people with agendas, and those agendas are informed by biographical, political, and philosophical dimensions. In other words, ideas, and ADR is not an exception, are derived from what we experience, what we believe, what we think should be. And this leads me not to explore just the methods of ADR, but the people, their biographies, the memories, the personal papers, anecdotes, and moral views. So the project I'm working is structured in 3 parts. Each part narrates one part of the story of ADR in the 20th century. I'm aware that in every retrospective reading or history, one must take decisions on what to leave out, and I'm happy to discuss that in the Q&A, why these players and not others. So, but the first part of the project, which is what I call chapter 1 or section 1, is framed in the progressive era, and it's part of the social legal thought It chronicles what I call proto-ADR, again, this process of formation of concepts, ideas, and practices of dispute management from pragmatists and social thinkers, activists, whose initiatives, as I will explain soon, were experimentations for managing social problems and individual conflicts in urbanized and highly industrialized, or at least starting to become industrialized context. The next section is centered on post-World War II period, and it's where a turn to the institutional in the field emerged from the work of two legal thinkers, Lon Fuller and Henry Hart, and more broadly, the legal process school as a jurisprudential school. So it starts with a legal education proposal chaired by Lon Fuller, where he argued that negotiation was a necessary skill for lawyers, and ends in 1971 with the publication of Fuller's writings on mediation, perhaps one of the important articulations or the first articulations of the theory of mediation from the legal perspective. And then the third part is framing the later stages of the Cold War, and it runs to the foundation of PON. It chronicles the re-articulation of the field in the work of Frank Sander and Roger Fisher, both founders of PON. They paved the way, especially Fisher, for the emergence of what I call ethical ADR. And the term ethical, as I use it here, does not have a moral connotation necessarily. Rather, I use it in the sense that Sander, but particularly Fisher, turned to the self as a site where conflicts are managed, thus developing tools to improve the way people perceive, feel, and communicate amid conflicts. So I will spend my remaining time mostly on proto-ADR, but I will say a thing or two about the other parts of the project. So let me start with the first player of my story, Jane Addams. I start with her. This is one of the people who, did so much that one feels lazy just reading about her. Just to give you a snapshot, she worked as a community organizer, as an arbitrator and conciliator of major conflicts, the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and a key figure to the development of social pragmatist ethics aimed to foster understanding across class, gender, and national lines. But perhaps she's better known, at least in the US, as the founder of the Whole House in Chicago. And this is where my story starts. The Whole House is the first proto-ADR experiment. What is the Whole House? It is a settlement house where upper middle class people move to lower income neighborhoods in Chicago and provide them services and help to the people living there. And the residents of the settlement were motivated to bridge the gap between social classes by participating in shared projects with immigrants and workers. So rather than a place to address material needs for the poor, it dealt with their intellectual and spiritual needs. And based on her work here, Addams developed the first pragmatist ethics anchored on ideas like sympathetic understanding, which is the process of paying attention to others and listening to their experiences that might better inform the problems troubling their lives, which resonates, of course, with ADR ideas like active listening, empathetic responses, and understanding the needs and interests of conflicting parties. And Adams also promoted non-resistance, which means force should not be used to coerce others into doing anything, an idea she got from Lev Tolstoy, the Russian writer and spiritual leader, who was an important intellectual inspiration for her. And this idea also resonates with a central notion in the field, which is self-determination. Now, I take the Whole House to be part of proto-ADR because it was a place where cooperation, social participation, and living with others forged a sense of being interdependent and solve problems together. To read this place as an experiment in conflict resolution is to emphasize that ADR is not just about creating processes and methods. It is also about designing places, holding environments, if you will, where people can develop through building capacities, a sense of togetherness, and overcome an atomistic mindset that the law back then promoted with ideas like freedom of contract or liberty or autonomy. So, but Adams also was involved in the Pullman strike in 1894, where she worked as an arbitrator and failed to bring the parties together in that conflict. The conflict originated because the company reduced 25% of the wages of the employees without making any reduction on the profit side. Despite Adams's attempts to bring both parties to the bargaining table, she didn't manage to persuade Pullman, for whom there was, and I'm quoting him, nothing to arbitrate. And at the time, the law did not mandate mandatory conciliation in arbitrations. So the strike was finally stopped by an injunction forbidding boycott and then sending the army. But her failure during the Pullman strike motivated her to work and deliver speeches promoting arbitration and conciliation to prevent future situations like this one. And this is why 4 years later, the Ehrman Act, which mandated conciliation and arbitration for any controversy in railway labor disputes, was enacted. Now, important to know is to notice that here, for Adams, arbitration was not equal to peace. It was a way to bring together interdependent groups of society to align their interests, but Proto-ADR here addresses social injustices and helps groups to become aware of their interdependence in society. It was not necessarily about getting to peace. More importantly, for her, arbitration was not privatized justice, but rather a dispute method used by people when the legal system appears to be rigged against their interest, and a mechanism for social justice. So the quote on the slide will give you a taste on her views of arbitration, how it was linked to a broader cosmopolitan project to enlarge human solidarity. And the quote on the right, as she says, from my own experience, perhaps the one symptom among working men which most definitely indicates a class feeling is a growing distrust of the integrity of the courts, the belief that the present judge has been a corporation attorney, that his sympathies and experience and his whole view of life is on the corporation side. So after sensing that, she paired with other activists at the time, and this is where another player of this story comes in, Roscoe Pound, because at the turn of the century in Chicago, Adams and Pound contributed to another experiment in Proto-ADR, which is the social courts movement, which was a project to modernize the court system in the cities. And as chronicled by legal historian Michael Wilrich, from which I built upon here, this project aimed to rationalize urban courts and make them responsive to social problems. In social courts, judges have, for example, the power to create specialized branches to deal with specific types of cases. They have also, for instance, examples of this is the courts of domestic relations or juvenile courts. But judges also have the power to hire experts like psychologists, social workers, and physicians to advise them in how to deal with specific disputes, or even the power to design courts procedures. So it was a way of transforming courts into laboratories to deal with disputes more creatively. Both Pound, who at the time was getting known as the representative figure of the socialization of law, and Adams played an important role in this promotion. Now, let me say a bit more about Pound, because before working as a lawyer, he, and this was surprising to me, did a PhD in botany. where he developed ideas I think were key for his jurisprudence, like mutualism, which means that interactions between organisms can involve sacrifices and still result in mutual benefit. So this organicist mindset impacted his views on society as a large organism demanding individual sacrifices for mutual benefit. And also Pound worked as a judge at the Supreme Court in Nebraska, where he experienced the formalistic procedures and led him years later to become the national figure, as you know, in his famous 1906 ABA address on the dissatisfaction of the administration of justice, where he criticized the formalism, the competitiveness, and the individualistic thinking cultivated by the legal process, disregarding any social consequence. And he wanted to move beyond an archaic administration of justice. And so he contributed to the social courts, contributed to a critique of the legal process, and he contributed to the basic units of the ADR vocabulary by adapting one idea by Rudolf von Jhering. And the idea is to replace rights as the analytical unit for the law for the notion of interest. For Pound, social interests lie behind rights, and therefore law was not about protecting individual interests, but balancing social interest. And let me just make a short parenthesis here, because if you have the opportunity to take any training in negotiation, you will recall that the notion of interest plays an important role, mainly because negotiation is not a discussion about rights, but interest, or the reasons why you desire something that the other party has. But for Pound and Jhering, the notion of interest was linked to the social needs and not limited just to the maximization of individual interest as it is used in more recent work on APR. Now, a third player, which Pound had correspondence with, is Mary Parker Follett. In fact, Follett wrote to Pound saying that his thinking was very influential to her. Follett is considered the intellectual mother of ADR and is one of the few thinkers cited in Getting to Yes, actually. Follett was a pragmatist philosopher, a social activist, a pioneer in management studies and organizational theory as well, and the creator of the neighborhood centers movement that were established to train people for that larger degree of democracy, as she put it, and to help them to learn how to work and play together, how to live not only harmoniously, but also effectively. So unlike contemporary ADR, Follett focused her analysis of conflict on group dynamics. She develops notions like the circular response, according to which we change not just based on our interaction with other people, but also based on others, and we interact with other people, interacting how the others interact, how other people interact with us. So it sounds like a riddle, but it's not. She didn't, for instance, think that the self and the interest are fixed. They are dynamic, and she was against domination and compromise as forms of resolving conflicts, and developed instead the notion of integration, which means a conflict resolution process to search and create solutions in which both conflicting desires find a place where neither side has to sacrifice anything. So conflicting parties instead integrate as being a larger unit or aiming at a common good. And this is a huge revolution at the time, because conflict for Follett was not something to overcome, but something that should work for us productively. And this is why she started the evening and neighborhood centers, to build from them democratic and civic qualities, understanding how conflict operates in societies. And in the slide here, you will see two quotes by Follett explaining this rationale behind the evening centers, and also on the right, the difficult notion that she developed of circular response, to understand how people behave in negotiations and conflict resolution. Now, what about William James? What does a psychologist, a founder of philosophical pragmatism, which is a philosophy based on the ordinary experience of common people solving problems and embracing this attitude of looking away from principles and toward consequences, has to do anything with proto-ADR? Well, James was a huge influence for Adams, Pound, and Follett. With Adams, they exchanged letters, read each other's work, and attended to some conferences like the Universal Peace Congress in 1904, where James thought about alternatives and equivalents to war. James was one of Adams's favorite philosophers, and the sentiment apparently was mutual, as you can see in the letter on the slide. Pound and Follett were also moved by his thinking. They quoted him often in their work. Pound argued that sociological jurisprudence is the legal dimension of philosophical pragmatism, and Follett credited James for some of her psychological views as well. Now, if you look at the slide, you will see a drawing that James did. Some scholars have argued that this drawing is an auto-portrait, and I think a good representation of one aspect of his philosophy, because he was focused on the self, not the social, like Adams, Pound, and Follett. In his life, James had suicidal thoughts that led him to cope with internal conflicts. Drawing from psychology and habit formation, he found a way to manage those. And so he responded to conflict by acting as if individuals have the potential to fashion themselves. This individual's psychological approach to conflict resolution, I think, came back or researched again in the 1980s, when questions were not about changing social structures necessarily and enhancing democracy from the ground up, but about problem solving or interest maximization and Pareto optimality. So let me offer a provisional conclusion here. I take proto-ADR as the building blocks of an intellectual movement dealing with individuals and social conflicts and responding to them in multiple ways, like creating spaces, deformalizing legal procedure, seeing courts as social experiments to govern and address social needs, developing group dynamics analytics to conflict resolution, or sometimes even adopting the view that conflicts are managed internally through habits and thought experiments. If you see the pie on the slide, proto-ADR, except perhaps for James, was concerned about how to make better distributions of the pie and how to sacrifice individual interests for social needs. Now, I will briefly touch on how I think institutional and ethical ADR shifted or transformed this understanding. And this is the emergence of what I call the shadows of the law or alternative dispute resolution. My story continues with Lon Fuller, who succeeded Roscoe Pound actually at HLS in his chair. And during World War II, Fuller worked as a labor lawyer, and he engaged in collective bargainings, negotiations, and participated in arbitrations. And this experience altered his approach to the law, which translated proposals to reform legal education, as well as articles on other procedures to manage disputes like mediation or arbitration. To give you an example, Fuller chaired the preliminary statement of the Committee on Legal Education at HLS in 1947, in which he initiated an understanding of lawyers, which is quite novel at the time, as conflict experts and architects of institutions and procedures. And this is the beginning of the turn to institutional decision-making. An institutionalized process was also channeled by one of Fuller's colleagues and friends, Henry Hart, one of the masterminds, as I was saying, of the Legal Process School, which was a jurisprudential school that prioritized agreement on institutional process over agreements on substance, and channel conflicts to the most appropriate institution or domain. be it private ordering, adjudication, legislation, or executive decision-making. So far, it's striking to me how Fuller and the legal process could capture the assumption, and you can read that in their work, that the pie is expansible, and problems about distribution are therefore replaced by how we can grow the pie to satisfy human wants via specialization of procedures. And the second contribution of institutional ADR is that Fuller recognized that adjudication is just one among many ways of making human relations workable. So he inquired about the essence of dispute methods and asked what was the benefit of this particular method, so that we know what they're good for, and when we have a conflict, we know how to pair those. This is sort of like the taxonomical question that started to emerge in the field. We have to know what conflicts there are, but we also have to know what methods do we have to address them. So for example, he thought mediation was a process only for dyadic disputes where enduring relationship exists. Whether that is wrong or right, it's not for me to tell, but it's just this way of thinking started to emerge in the 1970s. So if you see the pie, they replace the question of who gets what, and this is very important, and the social conditions, the social structural conditions that Proto-ADR was trying to modify, for the question of who decides, who's the best decider for this particular conflict. And this is how institutional design transformed ADR in some way, and it started to become more like procedural design, if you will. Now, ethical ADR, the last part of this, imply another huge transformation in the discourse of ADR and negotiation in the work of two HLS professors, Frank Sander, former professor of family law, tax law, mediation, and Roger Fisher, professor of international relations and negotiation, and better known for this audience as being the co-author of Getting to Yes and other books too. So in the early 1980s, Fisher created, from his work on international mediation, interest-based negotiation, which is a bargaining process where we translate our positions or interest, what we want, to interest, why we desire them, or the underlying motives. And in this process, we imagine options to expand the pie, of course, and to contrast them with our best alternatives to outside the negotiated agreement, ideally making both parties better off. And notice here how the notion of interest comes again. Integration and the expansible pie emerged, but in different ways as they were conceived in the early days. As you can see in the quote on the slide, Fisher focused on three domains as the sites where conflict should be primarily managed. Notice that it is not about institutions necessarily, but a change of perception, a management of emotions, and sharpening our communication skills. How? Well, for instance, in terms of perception, his work on managing nuclear war informed his ideas of fractionalizing conflicts into smaller pieces. In terms of emotion, the idea was to rationalize one's emotions and achieve self-control. And in communication, the goal was to meet each other's mind to maximize one's interest. So in this very early stage, ethical ADR, and again, I call it ethical because it shapes subjects to perceive, feel, and communicate in particular ways. And the pie can be still expanded in this new chapter of the field if we communicate better. So in other words, it is a project of self-fashioning or self-improvement, because the idea is that we can resolve conflicts if we improve ourselves. And finally, Frank Sander, and I'm still hesitant to include him in the ethical camp, mainly because he is better known for his idea of the multi-door courthouse, which is that courts should be places where disputes be sorted to fit the best dispute resolution process, the best door, to the specific dispute at hand. And this sounds like an institutional approach to ADR, because even Sander, who wrote the first textbook of the field, paved the ground for the programmatic approach to ADR. Because for him, ADR had 4 goals: relieve court congestion, enhance participation in dispute process, facilitate access to justice, and provide effective dispute resolution. But Sander also developed ideas about obligations to others, and comes more from his work on family law. He developed some sort of relational ethics, and his roots in Quakerism informed his particular approach to ADR. So in Sander's work, people are like in family, tied with one another, not just by the maximization of individual interest, but by trust, empathy, and shared belonging. And this is something I'm still exploring in his manuscripts. Now, to conclude, let me offer a tentative, but maybe a fallible, but a hypothesis, which this project is showing, and is a transmutation of ADR, which was originally rooted in social justice, relationality, and pragmatism, and slowly transforming itself to an institutional and ethical project where the pie to divide seems to grow bigger, and the questions of distribution remained of second order. Why? I guess I have to find out, because at the moment I'm not sure, but this is the pattern that I see emerging. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. And thank you very much, Nicolás. And as you were talking about Jane Addams being one of those people who makes you feel lazy for not doing enough, I would say that is exactly the way I feel about you and Helen when I look at all that you've accomplished and all that you still have to do. So thank you for that presentation. We do have a number of questions, and we will try to get to the maximum amount as we are able. So first question is, when you're looking at the historical roots of ADR, how do you avoid anachronism, which could be, a tendency that one would fall into in thinking about what constitutes proto-ADR?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And I guess that's a thread that every historian or every reading or narrative that takes a historical approach has to take in mind. It's difficult to sort of like wear off your present lenses and to see the past in as if it is not colored by your personal experience, but there are ways to constrain that. So one, you go to the archives, of course, and you try to get as much primary sources as you can and try to hear from the participants if they are alive, or if they're not, try to read their work in their best light as possible, but also read behind the lines, follow the silences. And that's what I've been doing, as I was saying, when I was reading Getting to Yes, and I came across Mary Parker Follett's example of the library. Perhaps some of you recall, one person wanted the window open, the other wanted the window shut, and they managed to integrate or create a creative solution to open a window which was not in the same room. And in that example, I was like, that's very insightful, and I want to see the source of that. And so I went back to the original source, started to read Mary Parker Follett's work, and saw that she was hugely influential at the time. As I was saying, some people consider her the mother not just of ADR, but also of management or organizational theory. And some of her work is still, she wanted to burn her papers, but luckily some were saved. And so that's one way of tracing the tiny almost invisible thread that there's always in text and in ideas, and you have to there's the danger of anachronism is there, but it's it's the it's necessary to constrain yourself in order to face that danger and overcome it. But it's important also to go back to the roots for an important reason. And it's because if we go back to our roots, we not only can understand ourselves, they might become mirrors of who have we become, but they can also be sort of like ammunition, metaphorically speaking, to expand the field in new directions, to see routes not taken. And this is something that is worth exploring, I think.
Wonderful. Very elegant answer. Thank you. We have a question from Karina about looking at other origins and international histories of ADRs, particularly in the Global South. So did you look at other areas and how ADR could have come out of that, or how it was, what kind of influence could have come from other countries and not just the US?
No, that's a great question. One that I've struggled with a lot. And I remember once a historian told me, everything is how you cut the cheese. And I was like, what do you mean? When you do history, it depends on, what frame of reality or what scale, temporal scale and physical scale do you want to look at? And that changes the flavor of the cheese, of course. If you can, for example, taste a tiny slice, versus a huge slice, it will taste different. It's a different sort of experience, and that happens in historical writing, I think. And so I was interested in this because I come from Colombia, and I know getting to US, I know interest-based negotiation was influential for the way the peace process was structured, and I was amazed how I'm always been interested in how ideas become so powerful that they are able to create these processes or inform decision makers that are doing that work, and perhaps what one gets is just like the final scene of the movie. But if we travel the path and the history of that, we'll see it's very rich. Many people have been credited. Many people are, in the shadows in a way, and deserve perhaps more spotlight. And so this is why my reading is more US centric, but it has so I pretend that after this dissertation in 3 parts, I explore how this went to the world in different peace processes in Costa Rica, Salvador, Colombia. So yeah, it is a global story, and it's also a global story because in the sense Adams visited Tolstoy. She got ideas from Tolstoy in Russia. She brought them back to the US. She was reading Italians, and so it is a global story, but the sources that I'm looking at are mostly from people who were Americans.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask one last question, and then we will conclude because I know we're already over time. But Nicolás, in getting into this research and going into so many well-known stories and figures and people who are important in the history of this field, is there anything that surprised you particularly as you have become more intimately familiar with this history than many of us are at this period in time?
Many things. I will say just 2. And as I was saying, I'm right now in the process of interviewing some of the founders of PON, and it's interesting how memories perhaps shape our experiences and the different narratives and understandings of what happened, or who was not the owner, but who got this idea into this text, and so on. um, might it has divergent, perhaps, narratives, and this is something that surprises me because I thought this was going to be sort of like a neat narrative, but it's more like a polyphony, like an orchestra. You hear the violin, but then you hear the cello, and it's becoming like a symphony of many voices, and reaching the field. And I guess the main point is, as I was saying at the beginning, it is important, the programmatic aspect of the field. We're in this line of work, but the history, the theory, the philosophy, it's also important because it grounds what we do as an intellectual project that can help also to think political issues way beyond the individual dispute.
Okay. Wow, wonderful. Thank you. And I know that those of us who joined PON at a later point in its history feel like there is a lot to learn. It's kind of like coming into a family with many stories and obviously a very rich history. So thank you very much for that. And congratulations to you on the accomplishment of your work and being so far along. I know you've still got ways to get to your SJD, but the end is in sight. So congratulations on that. And thanks to you and to Helen, we're going to conclude the program now, and with much appreciation and for you and for the nearly 180 participants who were joining us at any one moment. We look forward to seeing you at a future PON live event. We have Paul Robitaille coming to us on February 21st, and Francesca Gino and Julia Minson, two of our faculty members, on March 10th. We look forward to seeing you perhaps at a in-person or virtual training, either in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or right here on Zoom. Our new virtual intensive is actually almost full for January, but we are opening additional sessions in May and June. So whatever your connection to PON, we do wish you well and continue to send all of our best wishes to a new year. A big thanks to the PON staff for making this event possible. Diane Long, James Kerwin, and Billy Fairfield especially. Thank you all. Be well. Until next time.